Hey there, it's Laria. In this video, I'll discuss the different ways that you can help prepare yourself for raid progression at the start of a new tier, and I'll also explain the ways that I'm prepping for Castle Nathria, including the first legendary that I'll craft, the different conduits that I might use, and the talents that I might use. The first thing I do to prep for raid progression is to learn about the different fights in the raid. So this could either mean watching YouTube videos, reading the dungeon journal, doing PTR or beta testing if the raid is out. Having knowledge of the fights is really important, whether it's normal, heroic, or mythic difficulty, and it's also one of those things where either raiders do it or they don't do it. And it's one of the biggest things that I think separates guilds when it comes to progression, especially mythic progression. If you have a lot of raid members in your guild or on your team, and everybody does the research and they have a lot of knowledge going into a brand new raid tier, then that's going to separate you from a guild with members and raid members who aren't putting as much time or really any time in beforehand to get to know the fights. Gaining this knowledge and reading up on guides is technically considered research, and research takes a lot of time. But if you want to go into a new raid tier being prepared and having as much information as possible, then you need to be willing to dedicate the time to learn about these fights. Read through the dungeon journal, read what the abilities do, watch a 5-minute boss guide or a 10-minute boss guide, whatever you have to do. If videos aren't your thing, then you could also read a text guide. Just find what works best for you and learn as much as you can before the raid starts. That way, you're better prepared when you finally do get in there and you do face the boss. If everyone on your raid team puts in a little bit of time and effort into researching the fights and being prepared and knowing strategies, even if they're just loose strategies, then your group is going to be better off than a guild that isn't doing that. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen a raid group wipe because one player didn't know what to do with a mechanic, and if it was a soak mechanic, they ran out and then they died. Or if it wasn't a soak mechanic and they stayed in the group, they wiped the entire group. And wipes like that can easily be avoided if everyone just puts in a little bit of time. You go when you watch a boss video, you go when you read a guide, just know what the fight is, have a little bit of an understanding going into it. The next thing I do to prep for mythic raid progression is to make sure that my character is as geared as possible. And in this case in Shadowlands, it means that you're running all of your Mythic 0 dungeons or Mythic Plus dungeons and trying to get the best gear that you possibly can. It also means that you're running Torghast every week and you're getting the maximum amount of soul ash that you can possibly get, and then crafting your best legendaries for fights. For Castle Nathria progression, this might also mean that you are running Mythic dungeons or Mythic Plus dungeons with people who all use the same armor type as you. So for example, my Resto Druid has done its Mythic 0 dungeons over the last couple weeks with a party that all uses leather. So that way, if a piece drops from me and I don't need it, I can give it to somebody else in the group. And same with them. If they get boots or gloves or a chest or any other leather piece, they're able to trade it to more people, and that way you're spreading out the loot instead of them just maybe being a plate person and no one else in the group wears plate, so they just end up keeping that piece. So armor stacking can be really good. It's not required though. If you are able to armor stack a Mythic dungeon group, that's great. Week 1 in Shadowlands, my druid actually ran all of the Mythic 0 dungeons with a group that had 2 demon hunters, 2 druids, and a disc priest. So we had 4 people who wore leather and 1 cloth person, and that was totally fine. By the end of the week, my druid was actually around 174, maybe 176, right around there, so it still works out. There is still a little bit of luck involved, because if everyone has really bad luck and you just get these bad pieces that drop that no one needs, then no one's really going to benefit from that. But it is good to try to armor stack, especially early on in a raid progression, so that way when you're going into brand new fights, again, you have some of the best gear that you can possibly have. In Shadowlands, another thing I'm doing to help prepare myself for mythic raid progression is to make sure that I have all the legendaries that I need. So in this case, it is going and farming the legendary recipes that you need. For some people, if they drop from dungeons, this can be a little tough because the drop rate is kind of low. You might have to run that dungeon a couple times over and over again. I've had friends who have done that dozens and dozens of times so far. But if you have a recipe that drops from Torghast, that might be a little bit easier. But just make sure that you have any of the legendary recipes that you think you'll need going into mythic raid progression or heroic raid progression, whatever kind of raiding you're doing. That way you already have the recipes. When you get enough soul ash and you can make your next legendary, you already have the recipes ready to go. I also make sure that I have all the enchants and consumables that I need, which can be a little expensive at the start of a new expansion because everybody is trying to get the mats, they're all farming herbs, people gouge prices on the auction house because there's a limited supply. And so if you are doing normal raid progression or maybe even heroic raid progression, it depends on how much gold you have and how much gold your guild bank has. I've known some groups to use previous expansions, flasks and pots and things like that, and I think for normal and heroic progression that can be okay. But if you're someone who's going in to do mythic raid progression, you're in a mythic raiding guild, you definitely want to make sure that when mythic finally comes out that week after normal and heroic, that you are using the current expansions, enchants, and consumables. It's a little bit easier on my druid because I have always used herbalism and alchemy. I just really like those two professions. I enjoy farming herbs, or as I like to call it, picking flowers. So it makes it a little bit easier at the start of an expansion for me because I enjoy doing that. So I can just go out, get the herbs and the flowers that I need, and then level up my alchemy, and then I have all the consumables I need besides cooking. Enchants, again, might be a little bit more expensive. Another thing to note is that when your guild is going in to do heroic raid progression or mythic raid progression is make sure you have extra enchants in your bags. I can't tell you how many times someone in the raid gets a new piece and they say, oh, I'm gonna go hearth and go to the auction house, I need a summons back, because they didn't have an enchant in their bag. They didn't have a weapon enchant or a chest enchant or whatever, ring enchant, because that then holds everybody up because you're not there to help them clear trash on the way to the next boss. Please don't be that person. Please just go and buy the enchants that you need. Make sure you have extras in your bags. You're going to use them eventually at some point in the expansion, especially if you're clearing normal or heroic. You're eventually going to replace those pieces of gear, so it doesn't hurt to have extra enchants laying around in your bags. These are the basic things I do for raid progression, and there are a couple of other things that aren't necessarily required, but might be helpful for your raid group. So for example, something that isn't necessarily required is to assign healing cooldowns and other defensive cooldowns, like Rallying Cry or Darkness and things like that. You won't actually know for sure if you're going to need to move around some of those cooldowns, but if you know when the big damage moments are in a fight, and you know when you want to use your disc barrier, or when you want to use trank or revival, things like that, it could help to kind of map it out beforehand so that you're not using raid time to do that, and instead you can use some of that time to get some more pulls in on bosses. Chatting with other healers that play the same class as you is something that I don't think is necessarily required, but it is helpful. I've talked about in other videos before, networking and meeting other healers that play the same class as you is always a good thing, because if you are talking to another healer who plays a Resto Druid or a Resto Shaman or whatever you play, then you might learn some information from them. You might learn that they're using a different talent build than you are. You might learn that they're using different conduits than you are. They might have noticed something on the fight, or maybe they have some tips for you. So whether it's raid progression or just healing in general, it's always a good thing to talk with other healers. Now, I want to go into some of the decisions that I'll be making for my own mythic raid progression, and one of those decisions is the first legendary that I'm going to craft. A couple weeks ago, I published a video about the 4 specific Resto Druid legendaries, and in that video, I talk about how I'll probably craft Memory of the Mother Tree as my first legendary, and that is no longer the case. The first legendary that I will craft is Vision of Unending Growth, and what this legendary does is each time you have a rejuvenation out, each time those rejuvenations ticks, they have a 2.5% chance to create a brand new rejuvenation on another player that's nearby. I changed my mind and decided to go with Vision of Unending Growth because, once again, Blizzard ended up nerfing Memory of the Mother Tree, but they also buffed Vision of Unending Growth. Previously, it had a 2% chance each time one of your rejuvenations ticked to apply a brand new rejuvenation to a nearby player, and now it has a 2.5% chance. So this 2.5% chance boosts this legendary up quite a bit, and it now competes with Memory of the Mother Tree, but another reason why it's a little bit better is because it's a bit more manageable. There is still a little bit of RNG because there is a 2.5% chance. Memory of the Mother Tree was also a chance, but with Vision of Unending Growth, you don't have to worry about what ability you're going to spend it on, if it's going to be regrowth or if it's going to be rejuve. You just have a chance to create a brand new rejuvenation on a nearby player. The recipe for Vision of Unending Growth drops from the level 3 Fracture Chambers from Torghast. So if you're watching this video and the Fracture Chambers are not open, just wait a week or wait 2 weeks for the Torghast wings to cycle through until you finally get that wing that you need. For conduits, I'll probably use Conflicts of Elements, which increases the damage and healing done by your Convoke the Spirits. But if you're not really into this conduit, the alternative, which is also really good, is Unstoppable Growth. And what this conduit does is it affects your wild growth. And the way wild growth works is when you first use wild growth, the first initial hit heals for a ton. And then you leave wild growth hots on a few different people. So the issue is that with those hots, the longer that they tick for, the less healing that they do. So the longer they're applied to your targets, the healing kind of falls off a bit. So Unstoppable Growth, what this does is it makes it so that your wild growth healing falls off 20% less. In a way, Unstoppable Growth kind of gives your wild growth ticks towards the end a little bit of a boost. And this conduit could be even better if you decide to use Soul of the Forest talent, because Soul of the Forest, when it procs, if you decide to use that on wild growth, it increases the healing done by your next wild growth by 75%. So if you're using this conduit and you're using Soul of the Forest, your wild growth healing is already increased by 75%, and this conduit is kind of boosting those later ticks of your wild growth. Now I'll go over the talents I'll probably use for raid progression. In the first talent row, I'm probably going to use Cenarian Ward over Abundance because Abundance isn't that great with low haste. Since this video is discussing early raid progression, none of us are going to have high haste to make Abundance worth it at the start of Castle Nathria. That could change with better gear and stats. Depending on the fight, I might swap between Balance and Guardian Affinity. It really depends if the group needs survivability or if we're trying to push a damage check. This talent row is kind of up to you and what your raid group needs. If you are trying to push a damage check, then definitely go with Balance Affinity, especially if you end up taking the Heart of the Wild talent, which I'll go over in just a second. If you feel like you need more survivability, I would go with Guardian Affinity. For the next talent row, I mentioned Heart of the Wild, and this is usually going to be your go-to talent for this row. Heart of the Wild is a great damage boost, especially if you use Balance Affinity, and extra damage during raid progression is always a good thing. The level 40 talent row has some flexibility to it. It all depends on what legendary you're using and what covenant you chose. I'll most likely stick with Tree of Life. Tree of Life gives you an extra healing cooldown, which can be really good on high movement, high damage fights. Then I'll use Spring Blossoms and Flourish. At the time of this video, you aren't really ever going to use the other talents in these last two rows in a raid setting. However, if you crafted the Dark Titan's Lesson legendary, then I suggest using Photosynthesis. I hope this video helps you prepare for a brand new raid. Let me know in the comments what kind of raiding you do, whether it's normal, heroic, or mythic, and let me know what class you play.